January 6th. Are all your questions answered about that day? Mine aren't. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. Go back in time to January 6th and think what the major media said about that day. All Trump's fault, all Donald Trump's fault. Donald Trump staged an insurrection. Donald Trump is guilty of inciting violence. Donald Trump must be locked up. He's a danger to society, so forth, so on, and so forth. And before I get into all that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, the online platform for faith-based podcasts, at washingtontimes.com, where you may also subscribe to my Monday, Wednesday, Friday newsletter that comes out right to your email box, containing all my commentaries that I write at the Washington Times, as well as my twice-weekly Bold and Blunt podcast. And one more quick mention, you can get Bold and Blunt, you know what? Anywhere podcasts are offered. Just go to your search engine, type in Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley, and look at all the places that pop up. Subscribe. If you already subscribe, thank you. Thank you so much for supporting Bold and Blunt. Proud Boys leader Trump caused January 6th attack. That's the headline from Politico just a couple days ago, blasting out the blame of January 6th and all its violence on Donald Trump. A lawyer for Enrique Tarrio told jurors that prosecutors are using him as a quote-unquote scapegoat for the former president. Let's read this Politico story in a little more detail. Posted April 25th, updated same day, a couple hours later. Former Proud Boys, National Chair Enrique Tarrio, the man prosecutors have portrayed as the ringleader of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, told jurors that he's merely a scapegoat for the real culprit, Donald Trump. And here's the quote his attorney, Enrique Tarrio's attorney, said. It was Donald Trump's words. It was his motivation. It was his anger that caused what occurred on January 6th in your amazing and beautiful city. That was Tarrio's attorney during closing arguments in the trial accusing seditious conspiracy to many members of the Proud Boys and other protesters, other insurrectionists, however you want to paint them, who were present at the Capitol on January 6th. Here's my question for Enrique Tarrio's attorney, whose name is equally difficult to pronounce, Nayib Hassan. Anyhow, I'm butchering names, but here's my question for the attorney. How do words cause violence, right? Let's just put that right off to the side where it belongs. The left, in recent years, in recent decades actually, they have been busily trying to make it seem as if words, as if rhetoric, as if speech were dangerous. And on one hand, yes, speech can be dangerous, right? It can incite, it can drive others, it can motivate, it can inspire, but it can also do plenty of negative things too. It can push people, pressure people, compel people to do things that maybe on a different day, different circumstances, they wouldn't normally do. And especially when you get people in a group, right? There's speech that can drive a group to do something that the individuals making up that group would never, ever consider doing on their own. It's the study of sociology versus psychology, right? Psychology is of the individual. Sociology looks at groups and groupthink and things like that. But to say that the President of the United States caused violence on January 6th is a bit of a stretch here. Because, let's be real, Founding Fathers gave us the great underscore in the First Amendment of our God-given right to speak freely, to have free speech. The Constitution recognizes that simply by being born, you are endowed by your Creator with the right to speak freely. That's not to say that you shouldn't speak responsibly. That's not to say that you shouldn't speak tactfully, courteously, with wisdom, using discernment, right? All those things make up a civil society. But it is to say that offensive speech, hateful speech, vile speech, disgusting speech, vulgar speech, that's all your right as an individual, born and given that right by your Creator, by my Creator, by God. And the Constitution recognizes that individual God-given right in the First Amendment. Now, the left has been busily trying to tear down the foundations of America, starting with the First Amendment religious freedom, First Amendment right to assemble and petition your government for redress, peaceably assemble, your right to speak freely. The free speech right, the left has attacked very cleverly in recent times by slowly labeling some speech good and other speech bad. And the bad speech is classified as dangerous or hateful or intolerant or divisive, or the big one is dangerous speech. You can't say that. That's dangerous speech. You're inciting violence with that speech. But let's reel back that rhetoric and put our critical thinking hats on for a second, which if you're a Bold and Blunt listener, I know you always wear that hat, but there may be a few stray leftists out there that for whatever reason have tuned in to Bold and Blunt today. So I'm asking you in particular to put on your critical thinking hat and remember that speech is speech and action is action. And yes, speech can lead to action, but it doesn't necessarily lead to action. There's correlation and causation, right? Just because I say something hateful to you does not mean I'm going to follow it up with a whack on the head with a baseball bat. That is a matter of my heart, the condition of my heart, the stability of my mind, right? The concern of my spirit and soul that I will be held accountable to a higher power for my action one day. But that's not directly related to speech. Speech doesn't necessarily lead to action. And the left wants it believed that if you say something that is offensive to their poor snowflakey ears, then that means you must shut up and be shut up, and your speech from then on should be regulated and shut down whenever it treads toward that same level of offensiveness. Well, guess what? Founding fathers recognized that most of the time political speech was offensive to somebody, because in the political world, you have sides, you have divisions, you have people who believe this and people who believe that. And the people who believe this aren't always out there talking nicely about the people who believe that. And so the Founding Fathers strictly reinforced the idea that political speech is worthy of protection. Political speech should be free. And so when you have Donald Trump making a political speech, there should be bells. There should be that ding, 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 political speech equals protected speech. That alarm, that bell, that warning that goes off in the minds of listeners. But there is such an anti-Donald Trump atmosphere out there, a Trump derangement syndrome that permeates this culture, both on January 6th and even now, that the idea of looking with reality at what Donald Trump said and realizing that it's ridiculous to accuse him of inciting violence with his words, well, that in many of the minds of the leftists who love to attack Donald Trump, that has gone out the window. But look, this is exactly what Donald Trump said on January 6th. We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Powerful, pretty blunt, right? But is that the same as calling for violence in the street? I don't think so. Geez, we had Maxine Waters. We had Nancy Pelosi calling for summers of resistance. Maxine Waters telling her supporters to go to their restaurants, go to their homes, chase down all the MAGA supporters out there. We had Chuck Schumer talking about reaping the winds or whirlwinds or whatever when he was talking about the abortion ruling before it came from the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's strong speech all around here. And if the left is going to point to what Donald Trump said and accuse him of inciting violence and use this line here, we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, use that line to justify putting Donald Trump in jail, well then, they better clear the cells to the left and right of Donald Trump to make plenty of room for all the Democrats, all the leftists out there who have used harsher words than that to make a political point. Besides, Trump also went on to say this, and this is the part that the left doesn't like brought out. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Peacefully. Peacefully. There you have it. Peacefully. So how come the left doesn't like to talk about that? How come the left conveniently forgets that part of Donald Trump's speech? Well, because it doesn't fit the narrative, right? That's sort of a rhetorical question at this point, because we all know that the media is in it to carry the water for the Democrats. And however they can attack Donald Trump supporters, patriotic Americans, and so forth, they will, because that's what their overlords in the Democrat Party wish that they would do. And so now you have the trials going forth, and now you have people selling out Donald Trump because they've been threatened and intimidated and seen the inside of jails and seen how others have fared in their own crowd of January 6 gatherers, and they don't want that to happen to them. So whoever gets the offer, whoever can cut a deal, is throwing Donald Trump under the bus. It was Donald Trump's words, said Enrique Tarrio's attorney. It was his motivation. It was his anger that caused what occurred on January 6th in your amazing and beautiful city. Well, I don't know if he's toured the city, but, Washington, D.C., it has the foundation of amazement and beauty, but there's a lot of homeless drug dealers wandering about there, thanks to the Democrat controls put in place. But I don't want to wreck his narrative. And the main takeaway here is Donald Trump being thrown under the bus, the left trying to pretend that Donald Trump caused whatever violence took place on January 6th. And in the larger picture here, the left, the Democrats, trying to make the case and drill it into Americans' minds that yes, we have free speech in this country, but some speech needs to be controlled. Some speech needs to be regulated. Some speech needs to be cracked down and stopped by, the Democrats, because who knows better than the Democrats, right, how to control speech. How convenient for the Democrat Party to volunteer to control your speech and mine. The big thing here, though, with January 6th is there's so much floating out there that is misinformation or skewed information or wrongly reported information or just outright slanted information that it's really difficult to know truth from myth, right? If it weren't for Marjorie Taylor Greene being what the DC powers who be must consider a real pain in the you-know-what, we would hear very little about the plight of those poor suffering souls rotting away in the cells of DC jails. It's like the story nobody wants to touch with the 10-foot pole. Well, I have a guest with me today who has some firsthand information, a firsthand personal account of January 6 truths. Her name is Cynthia Hughes. She has a family member who right now is one of those souls rotting away behind bars. And she has a new book coming out that questions the narrative that the mainstream media, the Democrats, and even some in the Republican Party like to push and continue to push regarding January 6th. The book is called Due Process Denied: The Detained, the Families, the Fallout. Oh, remember that little constitutional thing called due process? Due process, right? That rings a bell. How about innocent until proven guilty? Well, all that stuff is out the window, it seems, and who knows better than somebody with a family member going through the January 6th bureaucratic hoopla right now. Cynthia Hughes, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Cheryl. I appreciate it.
The story about January 6th has to be one of the most difficult issues to uncover the truths about. And you've written this book, Due Process Denied: The Detained, the Families, the Fallout, and I'm assuming you have some firsthand insights to share.
I do. I have a lot of, insight and personal, comments and views on what's going on as somebody who is helping a lot of these January 6th defendants and their families, but also as a family member myself. As you know, or maybe you don't know, but I have a family member that is also caught up in this, who's been in jail since January of 2021. He's now here in New Jersey serving his sentence, a 4-year sentence on a nonviolent crime with no criminal history. This is very personal for me.
What's his story? What are the facts of his story?
So my nephew Tim, I have to say this to you, Cheryl. He's had a very difficult life. He is not my biological nephew. I grew up with his mother, and there wasn't a lot of family unit, if you will, within his family. And he lived with me on and off throughout his life. And more so in the last probably 10, 15 years, he has spent a lot of time in my home. A very troubled home, very troubled mother, who he is estranged from, and I'm also estranged from her. I, decided that I needed to be his family more than I needed to be her friend. And so when I got the phone call the morning of January 16th that he had been arrested, I immediately just jumped into action. And over the course of the time that he spent in D.C. As a political prisoner, because you're talking about a man who was denied his bond, not once, not twice, but 3 times, nonviolent charges, no criminal history, and because of some bombastic character things about him, a judge felt the need to keep him behind bars and sentence him to 4 years in prison. It's like unheard of. He literally is in jail, not because of his participation on January 6th, but rather, some insensitive content that they found on his phone of pictures and memes, very similar to what's going on with Douglas Mackey, in my opinion, a little bit harsher and worse for my nephew Tim, because Douglas Mackey was out on social media with his memes and with his jokes, with his comments. My nephew's stuff was on his phone for his eyes only, and yet he is kept in prison, denied his First Amendment rights. It's very, very disturbing, and he's not the only one. It's happening to many. So I got to know these families through my nephew. He would, call me and he would say, "Can you take some money out of my savings account and help, this defendant, that family, this one, they need commissary, somebody needs a gift card from a shopping, from a grocery store." And, after a while, I just realized that we needed to do more than just talk about it. And I just started finding ways to, raise money. And I started a nonprofit. We call it Patriot Freedom Project. I've gotten very close with many, many of these families. And I felt the need to write about it. And so that's why we put this book out, Due Process Denied: The Detained, the Families, the Fallout, to tell you some of the stories on what these women and these children are enduring.
Go back to Tim for a second, because I think he's one of many stories that Americans don't really know how to digest, because it just sounds so astonishing for a country that is supposed to be based on law and order and constitutional rights that favor the individual. You said that he was jailed, or he was convicted and given 4 years in prison based on what he had on his phone, not based on what activities he may have committed on January 6th?
Well, let me set the record straight. You know, of course he was convicted for a charge called obstruction of an official proceeding. It's a very controversial charge in connection with January 6th. And so he was convicted on the obstruction charge. But if you were to look at the transcripts, and I'd be happy to share them with you, if you were to look at the transcripts of Tim's bond hearings, Tim's trial, and ultimately Tim's sentencing, you will see that the prosecution clearly wanted to expose the contents that lived in Tim's phone. They wanted to character assassinate him, which they did, and they did it successfully. And that is what they focused on. They focused a lot on the contents of Tim's phone and the contents of what Tim's comedic, attitude is. And listen, I'm here to say some of the stuff that Tim comes out with is very, very bombastic and very insensitive. But it's not a crime in this country to be that way. And you have a government that exposed all of these things that were on his phone, in his computer, exposed his personality, I guess you could say, and used that against him. You had NPR writing terrible articles on him. Literally, the prosecution in his case tried to use a fraudulent, NPR article that was filled with nothing but lies to, in his pre-sentencing memo, to get more time added to his sentence. The people in this country, they don't know the half of what is going on in these cases. You cannot get a fair trial in D.C. There is not a single D.C. resident that is going to, be, maybe I shouldn't say a single D.C. resident, but most of them are not going to be objective. You had a woman who sat on the recent Oath Keeper trial. She was a juror. You had several jurors on that trial that were willing to acquit a young man that was on trial, and they were swayed by a D.C. resident who was, running the jury, and she got them all to convict everybody that was involved in that Oath Keeper trial. This is very, very dangerous territory. And if we don't find somebody who has the ability, the authority, and the mindset to do the right thing here and say, look, I don't like what happened on January 6th. I don't like Donald Trump. I don't like the MAGA movement, whatever the case may be. But we have to uphold the rule of law, and we are not seeing that.
Let's give listeners a quick foundation. When you look at January 6th, based on your research and what you found and what you wrote about in your book, how should Americans regard January 6th? Because the media paints it as if it was a violent uprising, and there are those on the other side of the political spectrum that say, nothing to see here, go home, folks. So how do you characterize it?
Well, listen, Cheryl, I'm married to a cop. I'm the daughter of a cop, okay? You can't assault the police. You can't, okay? I back the blue. I'm a very big proponent of the police and law and order, and so is President Trump. But we need to figure out why so many people felt the need to defend themselves against the police that day. That is very important, and the only way to figure that out is for all of the video footage to be released. You have many defendants that are asking for the video footage to be released, screaming from the rooftops to say, show my crimes, and let's see what we're being accused of. But you have a government that doesn't want to, release that. So I think it's easy to say that, for me it is at least, there are many people that went to the Capitol that day with bad intention. There are people that went to the Capitol that day that didn't do the right thing, but that is not the majority of people. And the sad thing is, because of the media coverage, only sharing all the negative, sides to what happened on January 6th, everybody that is caught up in January 6th is lumped into the same basket. And I would say anybody that's listening right now, be objective, do your due diligence, do your homework. You will discover that there are many, many, many people caught up in this who are innocent. Literally, people are being accused of violence. People are being accused of assault that didn't commit any violence or assault at all. And I feel very strongly when these people are going to court, these judges, they look at the defendant and they don't see what's behind the defendant. All they want to do is focus on what the impact, how to create as much shock and awe, because none of these judges like Donald Trump, even the ones that he appointed, and none of the D.C. residents like Donald Trump, and everything is about Donald Trump. These trials are horrific. I really encourage anybody that's in the D.C., Virginia area to come to a trial. They're open. They should all be televised, but they refuse to televise them. You used to be able to listen in, but they have stopped that now. I encourage people to come and actually sit in on these trials and see for themselves what is going on, the bias, the overcharging, the egregious acts of these prosecutors and these judges. Go look for yourself to see what's happening in the Proud Boy trial. This is a 4-month trial, and it's going to go on for another month. And you have a judge that is single-handedly trying to help the prosecution win this case and put these people behind bars for 20, 30, 40 years. It's really, really bad. And, Cheryl, we have a docuseries in conjunction with our book. It's also called Due Process Denied, The Families of January 6th. And if you go to our website, dueprocessdenied.org, you can see where you can purchase our book, and you can also see the trailer and the first episode in our docuseries. It will turn your stomach to hear from these families. It's heartbreaking. The American family is being obliterated because they support Donald Trump, and that is just not okay in this country. This is the greatest country in the world. We are allowed to think for ourselves, and we have a government right now that is clearly telling us that we can't.
One of the things that I found most interesting about Tucker Carlson on Fox News releasing video footage of January 6th was not even the footage so much as it was the reaction from politicians and government officials to the release of the footage. They went ballistic, and in many instances, it was just over the top.
It was. And I'll tell you a couple of things, my opinion on what Tucker released. Number one, we learned a lot about, I had already known, but a lot of people learned a lot about Jake Chansley. The situation with my nephew is no different than what happened with Jake Chansley. And my nephew will get released hopefully very soon as well, just the same way that Jake did, because of the First Step Act. My nephew has the same exact situation as Jake Chansley, the same exact. We can't focus on one person because there's a lot of people's lives that have been obliterated in this. That's just my take on it. However, let's talk about Julian Cater. Julian Cater was accused of assaulting Officer Sicknick. His sentencing was like a circus act. There was 100 Capitol Police officers at his sentencing and the entire Sicknick family who basically were accusing Julian, Cater of murder. Pretty much, that's what they were doing at this sentencing. That man got sentenced to 80 months in prison. 80 months. Had the footage been released to his legal team, like Tucker showed, Officer Sicknick in perfect condition, after he allegedly had been assaulted, maybe Julian wouldn't have gotten 80 months as a prison sentence. Maybe he wouldn't be separated from his family right now, his father. And they didn't bring him close to home like they did for Tim. They brought Tim. Tim's 45 minutes away from me now. This poor guy got sentenced all the way up to a prison in upstate New York. His family has to drive 8 or 9 hours one way just to visit with him. Same thing for a lot of these women. There's so much fallout to January 6th, and we haven't even touched the surface. We have not even touched the surface, and they're still arresting people. Every week we have new arrests. We have new families asking for help. We have new families, new defendants asking for help with an attorney. We are going to be dealing with this for the foreseeable future, at least until the next presidential election, and we have a different president in the White House. who hopefully has a conscience come 2025.
And what of Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was shot by the police officer? Did you look into the specifics surrounding that as well?
I mean, I know, a lot of the specifics, and let me set the record straight on that. She wasn't just shot. She was savagely murdered. She was gunned down, by a police officer who didn't hesitate to shoot, on sight. He didn't have to kill her. He didn't have to murder her in cold blood like that. It's disgraceful what they did to her. Do you know that woman who served this country so honorably, do you know they would not bury her with honors from the military?
Wow.
You have a mother who is heart sick. You have a husband who is heart sick. You have siblings. You have a family that is heart sick. This woman was savagely gunned down, brutally murdered by a Capitol Police officer over politics. I'm sorry. We got a real problem in this country.
If you look at political response, politicians on Capitol Hill and their response to January 6th, it's been really quiet, except for, say, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Do you regard her as sort of the hero to this, trying to get to the truths of January 6th, or is she, how do you view her?
I love MTJ. I love her. I've had the honor of meeting her a few times. She came to my Christmas event in D.C. in December, and she spoke to some of the families that I brought there. She's got a spine. She's got a backbone. She's not afraid to use her voice. She's not afraid to speak up. I've been to several rallies where I've, heard her speak about January 6th, and I've heard her address families. But she's one person. She's one person. I mean, Matt Gaetz does do the same, not as frequently or as much as her. Andy Biggs, who's another one that has spoken out. We did a press conference last year on the Hill in D.C., and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Representative Biggs and Troy Nehls and Louis Gohmert, they all came and spoke out on our behalf. But it's not enough. It's just not enough. I listen to Jim Jordan every day, and, he talks about the committee, and he's going to do this, and he's going to do that, and January 6th this and that. But I don't know who he's fighting for, like who he's speaking up for, because we're not seeing any action, and that's the problem. These politicians are more concerned about their career in politics than they are of the American people. But I will tell you, there is one other, and it's a senator, and he's a new senator, who doesn't care. And I think he shares the passion that Marjorie Taylor Greene does. And I think a lot of these politicians should take note of him, and that is J.D. Vance of Ohio. J.D. Vance donated to Patriot Freedom Project very early on. You want to talk about somebody with a backbone and somebody with a spine? He is not afraid to take, the hits and the abuse from this government and his opponents, and he has spoken out about January 6th. He has spoken out about, the defendants and the egregiousness of these cases, and he was elected. So these politicians, they should pay attention, and they should have a nice little chat with J.D. Vance, because he didn't back down, and the people elected him to office.
That is sad. There are only two, one in the Senate, one in the House. And just wrapping up, Cynthia, last question. I believe you just met with Donald Trump as well. And what's your takeaway from Trump if he were to win the White House again in 2024? Would he consider these political prisoners, as you put them, a priority to deal with, to help out, or do you think that he would just forget and let them rot behind bars?
No, he'll never ever let them forget. I have had the honor to be in President Trump's company, multiple times now. He is a man of his word. He's very passionate about what's going on. He loves these families. He loves this country. And he will do the right thing. He knows not everybody was at the Capitol that day to do the right thing. He knows that there were people there, posing as Trump supporters to try to harm him and bring more heartache for him. But he is a man of his word, and he said he will strongly look at pardons, and he will be, making that the first order of business should he get back into the White House. He supports what we're doing. I have been in contact with him for more than a year now, and his team. he has kept his word on everything that he, has said he would do. And he supports these families. He supports these children. He supports these lives that are, hurting and suffering. I was in Florida 2 weeks ago, and I saw the president, and I told him we would be there filming part 2 of our docuseries. And I told him how there was going to be several January 6 family members in town with me. And he said, "You mean here in West Palm?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Cynthia," without hesitation, he said, "Cynthia, I want you to bring them to Mar-a-Lago. I want to see them. I want to talk to them. I want to encourage them. Here is a man facing what he's facing in this country, the mountain of hate, the lies and the ridicule and the, the political theater that is coming at him." And he was able to put that aside and say, "I want to lift up and encourage, these families and tell them it's going to be okay." And that's exactly what he did with these families last week.
That's amazing. Like you said, somebody who is so under attack from the left and facing what he's facing with his family right now. That's amazing. Look, I really want to thank you for taking the time to come on Bold and Blunt and talk a little bit about January 6th and your new book, Due Process Denied, The Detained, the Families, the Fallout. And once again, Cynthia, give your website, please.
We have 2 websites. You can reach us at patriotfreedomproject.com. There you can see all the ways you can donate and support the January 6 families and the defendants and our lawyers, because that's important too. Or you can go to dueprocessdenied.org and you can see where you can purchase our book and where you can see the first part of our docuseries.
Excellent. Cynthia Hughes, thank you so much for your fight and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And isn't it funny that the one person in major media who actually questioned the narrative about January 6th, Tucker Carlson, is now gone from Fox News? Hopefully we will get the truth someday. I want to thank you for listening. Remind you, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, washingtontimes.com, and of course wherever you get your other podcasts. Tune in next time, and don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.